Greetings and welcome back. We've got another viewer question. Dear Doctor, why do we need to collect two sets of blood cultures from two different veins or sides? Blood circulates through the whole body, so what's the difference? Why do we need to protect the blood culture bottles from light before collection, but not after collection? Well, those are some great questions. First, though, we're going to have to figure out, why do we need to collect two sets in the first place? Well, there's two reasons. One is to increase the sensitivity by simply collecting more blood. Well, for that, it doesn't really matter whether we use one side or two sides, so that's not the explanation. The other part is to detect false positives, where you only grow something in one of the two culture tubes. And this is the reason we have the rule. Skin cleaning is going to remove bacteria from the skin surface. And most contamination is going to be from the skin surface itself. Now, when you put a needle into a patient, you are going to create a very fine plug of tissue. And that plug can get stuck in the needle, or it can get stuck in the butterfly tubing, or it may go into the bottle itself. But if it were to stay in your collection device, every single tube you collect from that will be contaminated. If every tube is contaminated, you can't tell a difference when only one is contaminated or not. And so determining a false positive would be far more difficult. So what we're going to need to do then is have a second collection using a fresh needle with a fresh preparation. Now, in theory, if you've done this in the antecubital fossa, well, the first one you've done, and then you're going to put your gauze over that. It's going to be very difficult to prep a new site and be able to collect it here. From a medical perspective, there's no reason you couldn't do it. In theory, then you could move down to the hand. But we know that hand collections are a lot more difficult, and we prefer to do the antecubital fossa. Well, there is one other antecubital fossa, and that's on your other arm. And that's why it's just a practical consideration why we say to collect it on the two arms. It just gives us the two best sites for collection. Now, there is something else with this that we don't want to be confused with. And that sometimes we'll ask for two different sets at two different times. And the reason for that is that we're trying to increase the sensitivity. The bacterial count in the blood goes up and down during an infection. When is it highest? Well, interesting, it's just before the patient has symptoms. Things like fever and chills, they're not due to the bacteria, but due to the body's response to the bacteria. And so interestingly, once the patient has symptoms, they'll actually probably have a fairly low bacterial count. By taking it two different times, perhaps one of them will get lucky, and it will be at that point when we have a higher bacterial count and give us that higher sensitivity. Now, the other question, though, is kind of interesting. And for that, we need to think about what the tube is doing. So what we're looking at these tubes is the button on the bottom of the tube, which originally starts off as a green color. Bacteria, like every living cell, are going to produce carbon dioxide. This button contains a semi-permeable membrane, which allows the carbon dioxide to go through it to the other side. Once on the other side, carbon dioxide will form a natural equilibrium with carbonic acid. To detect carbonic acid, well, it's going to be a pH change. So all we have on the bottom of this is a pH dye indicator. After talking with bioMérieux, it seems that UV light does actually degrade that pH indicator. So over time, it will start to turn, bleaches out to sort of a white or pale yellow color, which is very, very difficult to distinguish from when you actually have bacterial growth going there. Now, this is not a fast process. In preparation for this little lecture, I actually put one of these tubes into the window for 2 weeks. It hadn't yet bleached. But sometimes these tubes stay a lot longer. In fact, you can misplace a tube for months sitting near a window. And so it may have time to actually bleach. And that's why we say before you do your collection, you need to look at that button to make sure it's green. In the time after your collection until you put it onto the machine, at most it's going to be a couple of hours, and you probably aren't going to leave it in the window. And that's why we don't see the bleaching problem after the collection. We only need to look after the light before the collection. So hopefully that answers your question.